that.
Right,
Let's
okay.
move on to the second speaker. Chris Graham, University of Newcastle, on a very similar topic. So over to you, Chris.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. And thank you, George and Stephen, for a fascinating talk. Unlike Edinburgh, we were required to assess our stage 1 students. And so that is the topic of this talk. So I'm going to be talking about how we essentially use Numbas as a platform to assess our entire stage 1 program, pretty much our entire stage 1 program in both our maths and physics stage 1, semester 2. So we talk a little bit about the background to this, how we went about putting together this project, how it went, and some thoughts for the future. So for those who don't know me, so Christian and I, we make up the main components of our school's e-learning unit. So that's the School of Maths, Stats and Physics. And we develop the Numbas e-assessment software. I guess it's quite a unique setup in because we're there developing Numbas, we also can offer significant support to our colleagues around school. So that makes this very different from a lot of other scenarios in that our module leaders themselves aren't usually involved with Numbas heavily. So I will come back to that as I go through. At Newcastle, Numbas is extensively used and embedded deeply into our learning and teaching. It's used across a broad range of subjects, some of those listed below, engineering, maths, chemistry, biomedical sciences. It has the full support of our university, and that means that we are involved in sort of all of the communications around digital tools that are offered. So, so if anybody's in Newcastle, for example, an email went out today about our move, upcoming move from Blackboard to Canvas, and there we were as one of the headline areas alongside the same level as things like Blackboard assignments with information about how to move across. So it's really embedded very significantly in Newcastle, and nowhere more so than our. Oh, I'll come back to our school. I'll first talk a little bit about Numbas. So Mario this morning gave a very an excellent introduction to Numbas, talked about some of its features. I'm not going to talk about a lot of those here, but one thing I will pick up on is it is very versatile, both in terms of the actual content of questions, but also in its delivery. So, so in the project I'm talking about today, we're talking about using our Numbas LTI tool to record student attempts, but Numbas can also be used standalone. Even here, just using an embed code to stick it right inside the slide. So very neat. It's flexible. This uses one of the versions from the latest release of Numbas. This is awarded partial marks despite my forgetfulness about the constant of integration. So it's an incredibly flexible tool, and we use it in all sorts of applications as a result. Yeah, so nowhere more so than our own school of maths, stats and physics, where Numbas is a sort of part of a student's learning journey, if you like, through their degree program. So even the admission to our degree programs use Numbas for pre-entry tests. We send out material to students before they arrive. When they arrive at the start of the degree program, they'll take some diagnostic tests, and there's sort of supporting material move them, aid their transition into university maths. There is a huge bank of practice material that is used to supplement the content of each module. And then for many modules, we use Numbas for in-course assessments. So those are usually low stakes, bar a few in-class tests. So up until this year, we hadn't used Numbas extensively for final exams, at least outside of service modules. And of course, until this year, for obvious reasons. And of course, where we had used Numbas for high stakes final exams, it looked very different. So they would typically be situated in our university clusters, computer clusters, and use a lockdown browser, invigilated. So this was very difficult, very different, and posed some interesting challenges. So in mid-March, like many other places, we abandoned face-to-face contact with our students, and we moved to remote teaching. And as you'd be aware in other places, our university had to make decisions about what we would do in the assessment period that followed. And some very different choices were made, even to the previous speakers. So just picking out a few items from the guidelines, which are available online if you want to look at them. So no face-to-face invigilated exams was a no-brainer. The decision was made that all students should undergo some summative assessments to promote engagement. That was one of the main motivating factors. This third point was key, so that the assessments would be proportionate, thinking about both the marking load on staff and the burden on students. And this was a point I'll come back to, and one of the reasons that we ruled out 24-hour paper exams of a similar format to the ones that George and Stephen were just discussing. So the options given to us for our exams were a 24-hour take-home. So this was an exam paper released through our VLE. This would be an open book exam. Students could try it in their own time within the 24 hours, handwrite their solutions, and then upload it back to the VLE. We hadn't thought nothing as sophisticated as George for the online marking, but similar format, I guess. Or the other option was what was called an alternative assessment, and this was quite flexible, to be fair, but it had to be coordinated by individual departments. So they had some autonomy about deadlines and format and things like that. So the Numbas exams that I'm talking about today all fell into that latter category. So they were, strictly speaking, they were called alternative assessments. And we supported 14 of these assessments, all of which were in to do with stage 1 and foundation year. To give you a feel for the topics, so on the table there, that is our semester 2, stage 1 modules for our maths and physics degrees. So, so this was eight modules, but actually only 7 exams. One of them was co-taught. So a real mixture of subjects, some of them very challenging to move to an online format as well. On top of that, there were a number of other modules in various places around the university, engineering, natural sciences, and so on, where we were supporting Numbas exams, mostly writing content or helping to coordinate the writing of content, but a couple just helping to support using our LTI tool. The areas on the right, the exams on the right, took very different formats. So some of these were 24-hour online exams, some with multiple attempts allowed, some where students would see the score at the end and have the opportunity to improve it. So what I'm going to do in the remainder of this talk is just talk about our school's own modules, the ones on the left, for which we came up with a common format to use. So what were we thinking about when we were looking to come up with a format? Well, one of the main motivations was to ensure that students caught up with the material that they missed. So semester 2 had suffered from some quite significant disruption. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to get all students up to a standard where we felt that they would be able to succeed at stage 2. We wanted to minimize the impact. We've seen some of the strange things that can happen with technology from George's talk. So we want to minimize the impact of technical difficulties and also personal issues that students might have arising from the remote delivery of the assessments. So we're thinking about trying to be quite flexible in that sense. And we also wanted to avoid overly penalizing students because of an online format where mostly only final answers are marked, and things like those latest features around alternative answers, for example, missing the concept of integration, those weren't quite ready for us yet. So we wanted to think about being a little bit flexible there. Probably the most important consideration in deciding on a format for the assessments was that our stage 1 scores do not contribute to a student's degree classification. So with that in mind, we decided to go down the route of a pass-fail assessments using Numbas. So for the 8 stage 1 modules that were in that table a couple of slides ago, the format was as follows. So these were delivered through using Numbas. Each test would have a pass mark of 60%, so that's higher than the standard pass mark for these modules, which would be 40. We would allow unlimited attempts given to the students, and those attempts could be taken at any point through the exam period. So these assessments were open for the near 3 weeks of our May-June exam period. At the end of each attempt, they would see a score, so they'd know if they passed or failed at that point, and they'd see a mark breakdown. So this would tell them, which areas they did or didn't get correct, but not solutions, importantly. So they didn't get solutions at this point. So they would have to complete an attempt in its entirety without knowing how they'd done, finish their attempt, see the score and some indication of where they'd gone wrong. And then they would have the opportunity to take the assessment again if they had not passed. Because all of these modules had very high exam components, I think for almost all of them, they were 90% exam, 10% in-course assessments. The coursework marks were effectively discarded, and they've been retained to be taken into account for any borderline cases. As we'll see, actually, there were very few borderline cases, possibly because of the format. So we very much expected an extremely high rate of a pass rate here, given the sort of fairly relaxed nature of the assessment, plenty of time for students to catch up. But the key principle was that we had this quite high pass mark to encourage students to catch up on the material that they'd missed. This was quite a significant project. So overall, with around 14 exams in total, even these 8 school modules that we had, that involved over 20 colleagues. So that's your module leaders, your module checkers, and some postgraduate students who helped us. So as you can imagine, a lot of that work was done on tools like Teams and Zoom to do things like training and using a lot of the collaborative features of Numbas, where sort of conversation can be started and sort of flags put on questions to mark them as ready to use or need some attention. What did this look like? Well, so I've simplified this picture slightly because it was actually quite messy with the additional modules. Effectively, we had a module leader for each of these modules, effectively 7 of them because of the co-taught. And we employed some postgraduate researchers to effectively create content. And so those PGRs were distributed across the modules roughly according to their expertise. And the idea here was that the module leader would try to steer the content, give some an outline of what should be on the papers, and the postgraduate students with our assistants would create content. Following that writing phase, which lasted around 3 weeks, there's around two to 3 weeks actually of checking. So in this phase, we rotated the PGRs around the exams, so they were seeing seeing things with fresh eyes. And in fact, that rotation happened twice, I think, in the end. So we really had sort of quite a lot of eyes on the content. Of course, if you've sort of deployed assessment material before, you'll know that the only real way to test content is to give it out to 600 students and see what issues come back. And that would have been great if we'd been reusing material, but a lot of the material here was written specifically for these exams. So there was a lot of checking in this phase by the PGRs, by us, of course, and also by the module checkers. And they were given sort of one, they effectively checked one version of the randomized questions. So these multiple eyes on the content was really important. And finally, the module leader would give a final sign-off for their assessment and say how to be used. And of course, throughout this, Christian and I were offering sort of training for PGRs and to some extent module leaders. We were actually stuck in with writing content for a couple of the more complicated modules, and finally involved in sort of deploying the tests. So quite a big project. That went quite well, that structure. I think we learned some things about how to go about this. So as I said, we have quite a large bank of existing material that is used for these modules, but we decided when we were thinking about what we wanted for these assessments to stay clear of reusing content the students had seen already. And we went down the path of taking the past exam papers from previous years and seeing just how much we could transfer to Numbas. And the answer was quite a lot, actually. So we were thinking really about reusing exam questions. But in doing so, we had to consider a number of things. And Andre last night, gave some interesting pointers on some of these considerations, actually. So things about the searchability of answers. So how easy is it to put a question into Wolfram Alpha and get a response? So Andre pointed out some solutions, which are that you can reword your question slightly to try and prevent this, or ask for intermediate steps. And of course, there's a balance there behind scaffolding the question too much, you offering some guidance to the student, or do you just want the final answer? So there's a balancing act to be had there. Sharing of solutions. So we think that the randomization of the questions helped with this. So not only did we have variables inside questions randomized, but also the order of questions within the tests. So it was very difficult for a student to say, you know, my answer to question 4 was such and such. We made it as difficult as we possibly could. multiple choice questions we found quite effective, particularly to cover that. So like I say, we're trying to cover quite a broad range of the module. And so we use these to give that opportunity to cover that range, but also to check deeper understanding of some questions. And we use quite a lot of variants. So somebody mentioned earlier in the conference about always, sometimes, never type multiple choice questions, which are more effective than true false in some circumstances. Some of the content was challenging. I don't have time to in this talk to talk details, unfortunately, but some involved proofs. So that involved things like gap type questions where fill in the gaps for a proof. Others were computing with R, so we did that with sort of randomized data frames, things like that. So some of it was quite challenging, but we covered a large part of the exam papers that we started with. One thing, if you're going to do this in future, a suggestion from us is to specify in advance. So you have to remember that our module leaders didn't really have numbers experience. So when we asked them to come up with a sort of specification for what they wanted their assessment to look like, we didn't offer, I think, enough guidance about what we were looking for. So if we were doing this in future, we'd be much clearer about what we'd like from module leaders. So things like the wording of text, how it might be randomized, and that sort of thing. As well as the content preparation, there was quite a lot of technical preparation as well. So we use our Numbas LTI tool for delivery. There's some mention of this in the talk this morning. For formative use, we plug it into Blackboard. For summative use, we actually plug it into a Moodle VLE. And then we have application that allows students to access this through a secure browser. So the secure browser prevents access to the web developer tools because Numbas is client side. This is important for security of the test. And during normal times, this would be accessed on a university cluster PC. So we'd have quite a lot of control actually around what sort of device students were accessing tests through. And of course, that wasn't the case. So normally they would access through a dedicated application just for us at Newcastle. And you should be familiar with this. It's the Moodle login. And then test themselves delivered through our LTI tool. So this is the instructor view of the LTI tool. Gives us the opportunity to review remark attempts and that sort of thing. So we needed to make some changes for this exam period. So rather than have students rely only on our remote application service, we released a version of the application that they could download on their own device, and that was quite successful. We made some changes to the LTI tool, including sending out receipts, and a number of changes to Numbas itself, including sort of relaxing the being a little bit less strict on the syntax of input to prevent that sort of frustration for students, particularly if they've been marked down on the borderline because of it. So how did it go? Well, across all of those exams, our school and elsewhere, we had around 5,000 attempts from over 1,000 students, and actually close to half of those, maybe a third of those, were actually on the first day. There were very few issues with the content, so our approach to checking questions seemed to work quite well. We just had a few minor technical issues, including for our receipts. They didn't quite work out quite as well as we would have liked, and that's the thing for improvement next year. As you might expect, student performance was very high. The pass rate was high. The absent rate was very similar to previous years. What was promising was that students had to work to pass the assessments. So we'll see in a moment, less than half passed first time. So I think it did its job in that sense. One thing that was quite interesting was the approach that students took to trying the assessments. So so each of the bars here is one of our modules. The green, for those who can see green, is those who passed, and orange, those that were still in progress. So this was after the first day. Now, I must admit, I expected the vast majority of students to log in and have a look at every test, but that wasn't the case. So there's quite a bit went on the first day anyway. This was after a week, and I think we could have run this exam within a week, and students would have pushed through and completed. As it was, it went on. And this is at the exam end. You'll see what we end up with was very high pass marks across the board. Picking out one of those modules. So this is one of our core maths modules. So this is distribution of scores from 2019 versus this year. You can see that we sort of pulled up those marks from between 20 and 60 upwards. But quite promising to see a decent spread across the higher marks there. This is the number of attempts students particular module. So just less than half passed it first time, and then there's a sort of half-life thing going on with each attempt. Some taking many attempts to pass. I've sort of taken out here the trivial attempts where a student opened an attempt but didn't engage with it, just maybe to have a look at the questions. Okay, somewhere I've got a couple of minutes left. So we have an embargo on our assessment survey going out this week. We have a survey at the moment out on perceptions with remote learning. So that's going out tomorrow, and we're interested in particular in their experiences compared to semester one, where they had written exams. I'd like to know how they prepared for these assessments and how confident they are moving into to stage 2 in the next academic year. There were a few quotes from the remote learning survey. They were largely positive, but I've picked out 2 at the extreme. So this student said they were a time waste, very easy to eventually pass. I'd argue that if it was that easy to eventually pass, can't have been that easy. Second one, this was really the sort of feedback we were hoping to, so that the test took away some of the stress because of the unlimited attempts, and that they had to work hard to get the pass mark. There were the usual comments about working out, that some would like marks for working out, and actually this last student took quite a mature approach and said actually that it pushed you to ensure that your answer was right because of that. So there's lots of evaluation, I think, still to do. Okay, so I'm going to pretty much finish there. So so what's next for us? I think just like George mentioned at the end of the last talk, growing needs, I think was his phrase. I can see us doing this again. I think it worked well, but we'd make some tweaks, I think, for next year, both in terms of particularly probably in terms of the format about how long they'd be released for, but also we could consider breaking them up into smaller assessments, or even using specifications grading, as was seen last night. And that's it. Thanks very much for watching. Sorry, I've run over a touch, and thank you to everyone who's been involved with this this project. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Chris. That's very interesting. One question in the chat asks, all the randomization and clever question types can't prevent the students from submitting their problems to an online cheating site and getting their expert answers. This is the biggest problem. Any ideas or solutions to that?
Yeah, we discussed this yesterday, didn't we? I think unless you go down the online proctoring route, this is an issue, and hopefully part of our evaluation will tell us how much of this went on. Yeah, I think for these stage 1 assessments, I think the students understood that the they understood the format of the assessment. The point of it was for them to catch up. And actually, I had several emails afterwards saying, you know, can we have access to this material again to help us prepare for stage 2? I think they really saw it as much as a formative tool as a summative. Really, actually, it was a sort of jumping through the hoops exercise for them to pass through. But actually, they saw the benefit of taking part. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a perennial question for all of us, isn't it, really? I think.
It is, yeah.
More specifically about your approach to this, if I can ask. So Edinburgh appear to have just used their original exam papers rather than reformatting them for something like Numbas, whereas you folks have reformatted your exams. So do you want to comment on why you made that decision and any consequences of that?
So we reformatted the exams in terms of moving them to Numbas rather than written. Yeah. So
Edinburgh just sent out the exam papers as was, and the students took photos. I mean, that's a sort of design decision.
So so this was a lot about. So I guess from the burden on students' point of view, if we'd kept that long period that they were open for, I guess there would have been no harm in them writing their answers rather than submitting online. Benefits for us were largely around marking load. So these are significant size modules. We're talking 200 to 300 students in some of them. So there was a lot of benefit in that automated marking. But in addition, moving online give this opportunity for randomization that we wouldn't have otherwise had with paper exams. So with the long period that the exams would be open, we felt as though that randomization was a sort of key element to prevent sharing and looking up of answers and things.
Mm. Yeah, and did colleagues comment on that change in format? Was that an issue? Did you have that discussion in the department?
With module leaders, yeah. So so again, Andre was talking about this thing that we were consciously taking away some of that individual decision away from module leaders. And I think although we'd been allowed to do what we wanted at school level, we still needed agreement across our school about how we'd approach these things. I think the module leaders involved were very happy with not marking so many scripts. They saw it as a sensible solution. Yeah.
Can I ask, do you mind, Chris, if I ask George to come and answer the same question from the other perspective? Was there, why did Edinburgh send out the exam papers as is? Why didn't they use some automatic marking? And how did colleagues find all that? All right, hunting around for your microphone, George. Sorry.
Before George answers, what I will say, the other big factor was this was stage 1, and we didn't for stages 2 and 3. We wanted to see that working out, and ensure that we could both give those marks, but actually see the student actually writing maths. So yeah, I'll let George.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, George.
Yeah, I was going to pick up on that point because our exams were the 3rd and 4th year exams, and
right.
We did have a bit of conversation within the department about slight tweaks that you might make to the exam to have less of the kind of copy down the definition of this, which is more meaningful in an exam hall, but not so much when it's open book. So we made some small tweaks to the exams to suit the open book format, but I think coming up with a way of assessing things automatically at speed was not going to be possible, I think, for a lot of those courses.
Yeah. Thanks, George. Chris, we've got another question here in the Zoom chat saying, do you think the students repeating the assessments would be better prepared than usual for next year?
Repeating the assessments during the exam period, I presume, rather than, for example, the sit period.
Repeating assessments.
Yeah, I think so. I think, I mean, you saw from the mark distribution, so it's essentially the content was not far off what the exam content was from the year before. It's obviously slightly different questions, but in terms of difficulty, it was very similar. So on the first attempt, you might very well imagine that students would be there in the 40s and 50s, especially given the gap in contact time that they've had this semester. So giving them the opportunity to try again, give them the opportunity to go away and scratch up on those questions that they didn't get correct, and so I think they probably did benefit from that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Chris.